Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather outlook for today, July 28th, 2024. We're talking about watching the Atlantic today, especially the Western Atlantic, as we head over the next week. Things could get interesting as there is a moderate chance of development as of right now in the Atlantic. So let's start off with that for today, going over the National Hurricane Center outlook as of 2 o'clock. There is a moderate chance indeed for a disturbed area that is in the central western MDR. Models have been pretty aggressive with this, especially the European. Other models have been flip flopping, but models like the European have especially been very adamant that this will try to develop as it moves westward and gets into the general Western Atlantic, especially around the Bahamas and Greater Antilles area as we head towards the end of next week. And the National Hurricane Center, as a result of that, is giving a 40% chance that something could develop over the next week. Right now, though, over the next 48 hours, not much going on, but this is really going to be the biggest area of concern as we head over the next several days to week once again in the Atlantic as we head towards the beginning of August. And I should say interests in the Caribbean, especially the Northern Islands, and even those in the Southeast should keep a watchful eye on the system, but especially impacts beyond the islands and potentially the Bahamas right now, I think is still very much uncertain, and it will very well depend on what exactly happens as this disturbance moves westward. All things that we'll try to answer today. In the Eastern Pacific, though, there's also lots of activity happening. Three potential areas, two of them have a low chance, and then we have one that is off the southwest coast of Mexico, and this has a high chance of development. Looks like we might be not far from getting our next tropical depression in the Pacific, still very much behind schedule, but we're slowly beginning to catch up. And it does look like there is potential support for other systems to occur there as well. Looks like the Eastern Pacific is coming up on a potentially pretty busy time. And they might see a couple of extra named storms over the next week or two. So we'll be monitoring the Eastern Pacific very closely as well. Here's a satellite shot of the Atlantic, and today I decided to go for a lot more of a larger and more beautiful satellite shot, if you will. This is from the NOAA NESDIS website, Goes East satellite imagery. Very nice satellite shot. I think I should use this honestly a lot more often. But anyways, here's a shot of the Atlantic. You could see, especially through the deep tropics right now, you could see our tropical waves. This wave right here is generally the area that we need to watch closely. This is the one that the models show amplifying, especially as it heads towards further west, especially the European, and it really begins to develop somewhere just north of the islands, and then as it heads into the Bahamas. But as of right now, this does have quite a bit of dry air to deal with. There's lots of Saharan air to the north, especially, as well as just generally very dry, mid-level mid levels of the atmosphere. Very typical for this time of year. We're still in July. We're not yet into the peak, although things will begin to gradually become more favorable from here on out. Things are still not quite favorable, at least in the near term, which is why we're not really expecting much development out of this. But you could see it is still there. We also have another wave coming off of Africa. It looks like some very interesting feature near Central America. This is probably going to be one of those areas, though, that we watch in the Eastern Pacific, as we just saw highlighted. Here's a shot of the 850 millibar vorticity, and you could see very much weak right now. I think the wave energy is right in here, and you can see it is very weak right now. We just saw the satellite where there was not really much convective activity. Well, there's also not really that much strong vorticity as well associated with this wave. Looks like maybe the wave behind it has a little bit more vorticity, but there's no model signals with that. But in general, this is going to move towards the west-northwest, and things in this general region are looking to be more favorable, that this could amplify and once again develop. And remember, sometimes when I do say it's not always that we're going to get these waves to develop in the eastern and central MDR. Sometimes these waves may not be doing so well in the east central MDR, but sometimes that just means that they might not develop here, but that doesn't mean that waves won't develop in the Western Atlantic, where oftentimes, especially this early in the season, conditions are more favorable, and that's where these waves that do develop end up developing, and it's in the Western Atlantic. And there have been also some pretty notable historical events that we can point to of waves that kind of struggle in the MDR, or even systems that kind of struggle in the MDR, but kind of blossom and explode into very formidable systems. Not saying that this one will, but in general, some of these systems have been very formidable in the past. We can point to storms like Katrina, Rita, even Laura when it started in the Western MDR, but kind of struggled a little bit as it got into the Caribbean, kind of because it did ride the Northern Islands, but it blossomed once it got into the Gulf. And even a storm like Ida or even Ian too. The bottom line is that that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that sometimes these waves might not develop in the MDR, but that doesn't mean they won't develop elsewhere further west in the Atlantic. And it definitely seems like this will be one of those cases where that occurs. But you could see that it's definitely going to be one of those cases, because once again, just want to drive home the point of lots of dry air in the Atlantic, and this is what's going to really inhibit development in the near term. And this will also have a really important factor on how much this amplifies before the islands, which will then impact, of course, track and sort of intensity as well past it. But you can see right now lots of dry air in the mid levels. Part of that is Saharan air. The other part of it is just generally very dry mid levels because of tut action. I know that there's definitely one tut that is over the Caribbean right now, and there's lots of shear as well. But that will die down, and things do actually look pretty favorable once this gets towards the Bahamas. But that'll be an inhibiting factor for right now, which is why we really don't anticipate development, at least within the next 48 hours, as the National Hurricane Center pointed out, really looking like a 0% chance that we'll really get much of anything. But what does that look like, obviously, over the next several days? I want to start off in terms of modeling with the European ensembles, because one, you could also see generally before the islands, there's not much that happens. But especially after the islands, and I pointed to the European specifically because this model has really been the most aggressive with this system. And there's a really interesting point as to why, because you notice lots of the ensemble members, most of them, um, end up having the storm go north of the islands. I guess they pick up on this potentially amplifying more as this gets towards the islands. So then we see development as it approaches the Bahamas. And as a result, as this moves off the East Coast, and that is something to pay attention to as well, this will get very close to the East Coast, but at least by the ensemble members and the operational European as well, most of them keep them off the East Coast, and a lot of the ensemble members as well as the operational Euro, which we'll go over in just a moment, has this system becoming quite a decent hurricane off the East Coast as it heads over the Gulf Stream and then out to the Northeast, and then probably impacting some place like southeastern Atlantic Canada or so. And I think this really is something to pay attention to, because if this especially amplifies a lot as this gets towards the islands and we end up seeing a more stronger wave that is north of the islands, this will really help play into the solution of what the European shows, or the EPS ensembles show, of a much more formidable system that remains near or just off the East Coast. Obviously, though, ridging and other factors like that will depend on how much this stays off the East Coast, or if this does actually mean this could be an East Coast threat. But that generally lies within 7 to 10 days, so I'm not entirely sure about that. But the other kind of aspect is the GFS, and the GFS is kind of the other opposite to this system, in that if you look on the 12Z run, I think the 12Z run kind of, at least the comparison between the GFS and the Euro for the 12Z kind of drives the point home. The GFS, on the other hand, kind of takes this and does not amplify the system much. And in runs earlier today and even yesterday, the GFS did not even amplify the system at all. It just kind of had this as a wave that moved through the islands, which I do want to point out, regardless of whether or not this will develop, the island should probably watch out for some gusty conditions through the end of the week into early next week associated with this wave. But then the GFS on the 12Z run, once this does get past the islands and then into the Gulf, so we're talking about a more southerly and westerly track. The GFS then amplifies this in the Gulf, and I guess we start seeing some development as this heads into the northern Gulf Coast. So you can generally see a pattern associated with this storm, and then that takes us basically out to the next 7 to 8 days. And once again, the GFS more or less targets the Gulf Coast, on the eastern Gulf Coast with this system. So I think that generally kind of drives home the pattern of if we see this more as a system that impacts the islands, then we kind of see this a little bit further to the west and south, and that kind of results in something we watch for the islands and then potentially into the Gulf. But on the European, on the other hand, let's actually go to the European 12Z because I'm not even sure the 0Z is at the 12. Well, the European 0Z because I'm not sure the 12Z is out. That's what I meant to say. Here's the 12Z of the European. Sometimes I kind of get ahead of myself and I kind of mix things up a little bit, but I'm pretty sure you understand. The 0Z of the European, you could very well see what I'm talking about. The European has much more of an amplified wave. All of the energy kind of focused north of the island, so we don't have that interaction inhibiting it. And then what do you know? The European amplifies this pretty well, and right out to the next 7 to 10 days becomes a pretty formidable hurricane off the East Coast, right in the Gulf Stream, and then that potentially means impacts to watch for Atlantic Canada. So you can kind of see the contrast pretty well. And then also, if this ends up in the Bahamas, something I pointed out on Twitter earlier today, let's actually get a little bit of a closer shot of this storm north of the islands too. When it comes to development, it kind of makes sense why the European shows quite a formidable hurricane off the East Coast. This is just into the next 5 to 6 days as this approaches the Bahamas. You can see by the 200 millibar winds, because that's what this is, represents winds in the 200 millibar level of the atmosphere. So way up in the upper levels. Very light winds, so that is a plus in development. That is something we look for a developing tropical system that is favorable. And then notice as well this setup of these upper level winds moving outward and far away from the low pressure. This is an upper level anticyclone, and basically this means enhanced outflow, which allows the air from a developing system to evacuate away. And basically, how I like to explain it is a storm is able to breathe in, and then the outflow means the storm is able to breathe out and ventilate its air away from it. And that is all part of a very favorable cycle for a tropical system. So basically, this kind of look, what I'm trying to say, is that it is a very favorable look, and that means probably low wind shear. And then you can see as a result of this, 989 millibars, 986, you can see as well. Probably in reality, if I'm going to be honest, would probably be stronger than that, just knowing that the resolution of the model, obviously global models don't really have that great of a handle on intensity. Moves out, and result of this very favorable pattern obviously becomes a hurricane as it's moving away and off the East Coast and into the Gulf Stream, just on par with what the European shows. So we have that aspect of it as well, that it looks like things could be probably more favorable for it too, if it remains off the East Coast, which is why the European has a very strong solution, or a more aggressive solution with this system. Plus, obviously, if we look at the sea surface temperature anomalies, one thing, they are very much above normal across the Atlantic, but especially focusing on the Bahamas and the general Western Atlantic areas on average, 0.5 to even 1 degree Celsius, as well in the Bahamas and off the East Coast. So this will also have very warm sea surface temperatures to work with, and that'll also add that extra level of kick for this system. And also the tropical cyclone heat potential too, basically a kind of another layer in terms of sea surface temperatures. This is also a really nice map This is by Cyclonic Weather, by the way, made by Alex Borham. So kudos to him for making this map. And you can see the tropical cyclone heat potential values off the East Coast, especially with the Gulf Stream. They are very heightened. Sometimes the Gulf Stream is kind of like its own sort of kicker as well. The Gulf Stream associated with the loop current that we kind of see poke out from the Caribbean, then north into the Gulf, and then kind of rides into the Gulf Stream as we know it, that goes off the East Coast. And that kind of has its own extra sort of energy associated with it too. So in general, things are just very favorable for the system as it gets off the East Coast, or it's just off the East Coast, leading to why the European shows a much stronger solution, while the GFS, on the other hand, has a much weaker solution and something that probably develops later, which is why, obviously, we have this agreement between the GFS and the Euro, and that is why we should be watching, as it's even said in the title card, we should be watching the Western Atlantic very closely. And we should also mention that we should be watching now because all of this is still a week out. So there's still lots of things to potentially change, and we really can't be sure yet as to whether or not this will be something that is off the East Coast like the Euro shows, or maybe the GFS is correct and this ends up as something more weaker and more west, and that would probably mean more concerns for the Western Atlantic and potentially the Gulf as well, or even potentially that the ridging is stronger or so, and this is something that is off the East Coast but actually threatens the East Coast too. So many questions to that, honestly, once again, as I'll say, and I'll probably continue to say, and it's probably the number one golden rule in hurricane tracking, is a lot of these questions really are only going to be answered with time, and time is what we're going to need to contend with at least over the next week when it comes to watching this system. With that being said, though, I'm going to end it off for today. Really hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, really would appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe as well. Have been getting quite a few new subscribers lately. Thank you so much for that. Hopefully we could keep the train going, just as a hope. Not asking for too much crazy, but it would really be nice. And if you also have any questions as well, post them in the comments too, and on Twitter as well, because I do have a Twitter account. Basically my name right here on YouTube. You could just search it up on Twitter and you'll be following me. And if you have any questions there as well, I'll be more than happy to answer them. With that being said, stay safe, have a great day, a blessed one. Peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we'll talk again tomorrow.